start off with just a few words about how ecological monitoring's been done historically, and before covering off on research infrastructure to give you the context of our program, and then give you an overview of what TERN is and does, so that you can understand how it might be a benefit to you. So historically, environmental monitoring's been sort of disparate methods and data collections. Often particular programs have unique methods. It's often been conducted at the smaller scale, so really local scale questions and investigations. And occasionally the aims of the monitoring's been unclear, and then certainly at larger scales that's true. It's often had parochial opinions and been sort of quite lab-based. So a particular research lab will have a particular focus, and less frequently is cross-disciplinary. It's also funded in a sort of fairly ad hoc way, so on a project-by-project basis, where that funding is organised in a sort of competitive rather than a collaborative way. And that leads to people creating different methods to collect the same information, etc. And what that means is that detracts from our ability to monitor the environment in a holistic sense. And so TERN was created in part to deal with that. Oh, excuse me. At this point, it is worth just a few words on research infrastructure. So we're not a research program, we're a research infrastructure program. And the NCRIS program originated out of the back end of the global financial crisis. And when the economy needs stimulating, of course, we've all seen the government invest in infrastructure, and the mess that is South Road at Darlington, etc., is a good expression of that. They invest in infrastructure because they see that it makes things more efficient longer term. In that case, me getting home from work. But in this case, they've put aside a set of some funding to create research infrastructure, and TERN is Australia's environmental research component of that, with the same kind of big picture goals as any kind of infrastructure. So the idea in an environmental context is that we collect information once but are able to use it many, many times. The really costly component of data collections has largely taken care of by another group that's funded to do that, in that case, in this case, us. And anyone who's tried to budget for a grant, etc., will understand how costly actually getting out in the field and collecting the raw information can be. It also enables the collection of information at a scale that no individual grant or research group could afford to do. It enables us to utilise standards, so to collect the same information in the same way, using the same methods, and deliver that in a standard way right across the continent. It enables us to prepare to do pre-processing to get the data research ready, and so you all of course be aware that once you've collected the data, entering the data, managing the data, processing it, getting it, do those pre-filtering steps, etc., ready to actually analyse it, can be hugely time consuming. And so approaching the issue in a research infrastructure sense enables us to do that once and everyone to benefit from that. It also enables our data to be interoperable and well described, and so you complete information on what you have access to is there, and you get the full information on where and why and how it was collected, etc. And really importantly, I think, and one of the most exciting things of the program is it enables types and scales of analyses that were just not previously available to the research community under the sort of previous model. And so looking now at environmental monitoring, I think when we want to work out what we need to monitor about the environment, it's hugely big picture and a generalisation, but to monitor ecosystem change comes down to, I think, 6 fundamental questions. So where's that change occurring? When is that change occurring? What components in the environment are actually changing? What's the direction and magnitude of that change? Why is that change occurring? And what management interventions or how can we impact that change so it's occurring in the direction and the magnitude, etc., that we would hope for. And so this is a sort of complex slide. I don't need to get across it all, but the key message from this is that to answer all those questions, there's not one simple type of monitoring that can easily answer all those questions over large areas. So there's what we've recently articulated, you got the reference down the bottom there, but a paper published earlier this year, is that there's 3 distinct types of ecological monitoring. So there's landscape monitoring, which excels at the where, and more recently with increased computing power and increased temporal availability of satellite imagery, does a good job now of addressing the when is change occurring as well. Surveillance monitoring, which we'll touch on all of these a bit more further into the presentation, but that's really its strengths are measuring what's changing and what's the direction and magnitude, how much change is occurring. And then there's targeted monitoring, and this is probably most familiar with the traditional way of looking at things. So you're quite specifically question driven, getting at why are things changing in the environment, what's the cause, and what's the effect of that change. And so that's really influenced how we've thought of doing things in TERN. And so we are structured in a similar way that addresses and makes sure that we deliver on each of those 3 scales of ecological monitoring. So there's local scale monitoring, and that's the why is change occurring. We call that ecosystem processes. There's regional scale monitoring, so the what and what's the direction, what's changing, what's the direction of change. We call that ecosystem surveillance. And sorry, I skipped on a bit there, but the last scale, the sort of continental-wide monitoring, is about the where and the when, and we call that landscape monitoring. And so we mirror that in TERN. That's TERN's structure. We've got 3 data collection capabilities that each address one of those, but also work really closely together because these aren't hard lines. Each of these scales interacts and needs to interact with the other. And indeed, the prime argument in the paper this refers to was that for your best output, you actually need all 3 types of monitoring, and we would clearly argue that as well. On top of that, we have central coordination capability that's based at the University of Queensland. The landscape scale is based at CoESRA. This surveillance monitoring is my team based in the Davies building here at U of A, and processes is based at James Cook Uni. And the last component, the data, which sort of synthesizes the data out of each of these 3 monitoring scales and provides them publicly, is also based out of the University of Queensland. So this leads to some infrastructure right across the continent. So if we look at first that landscape scale, this why Australia's covered in here, is because it covers off on everywhere, but then has some specific sites where they collect information at much greater detail, but specifically focusing on calibrating and validating the images and hence the products that they create across the entire continent. The surveillance team, these are all the dots there, and we'll cover off on this a bit more later, but that's going out and measuring plots right across the country in a consistent, standardized way at many places. And then the processes capability here is specific sites, usually 1 per major ecosystem type, where they're really highly instrumented, and we have a real understanding of what's happening there and how each of those components are well interacting with each other. So it's worth delving into each of those just in a little more detail. The landscapes component. So this is the top component, the where and the when. So they conduct monitoring primarily using remote sensing techniques to characterize particularly that where and when. And so most of their products are at a continental scale, though there are some sort of airborne products, etc., used for scaling up that are more locally based. And the platform also does a whole lot of modeling and synthesis information to help extrapolate or interpolate those observational data to modeling outputs that are more general across the whole continent. Just a reminder, you know, those sites being the information being right across the continent, but specific sites where more information is collected. And so they deliver a range of data streams used to categorize and detect change, often related to vegetation structure and composition, land cover, bushfire dynamics, those kind of elements of the environment that we can relatively easily and using well-established methods detect from satellite imagery. But the platform also integrates data from TERN soil and landscape grid. And so that's a program that models a massive amount of field-based soils information and provides that across the continent as well. In a landscape sense, in a remote sensing sense, that component of the landscape program, they look at like land cover dynamics and phenology, vegetation composition and diversity, where fires occur and severity and impact, a range of vegetation structural properties and moving into biomass. So we already collect a range of information that's informative on biomass, but are now doing the next step where we'll help synthesize that into biomass products. And it's worth noting that much of the work out of landscapes feeds into international programs. So heavily involved with at least 3 or 4 NASA science missions where our information is used to help validate satellite imagery. In a biomass sense, that's really relevant to the JEDI program. They have some field survey data sets, but as I've discussed earlier, they're specifically designed to validate or calibrate that imagery. There are some airborne data sets. They do the research necessary to correct their products through the surface reflectance, and have some range of other information too: solar radiation, rainfall, water, vapor pressure, just a few examples. You also see the picture of the drone there, center screen, and that's a program that both landscapes and ourselves are collaborating on, where we hope over the next couple of years to build an operational program when my team are out in the field collecting all their traditional ecological information, they also fly the site using a UAV with multispectral imagery. That will then enable scaling up. Will enable people to analyze that imagery using our data, but will also help to scale up to some of the broader, larger resolution satellite products as well. Soil and landscape grid, as I discussed, models about 25 different attributes there. You can see them on the lower right, and does that consistently right across the country. And once again, I guess, as I tried to allude to, the distinction between these scales of monitoring is blurred a little, in that these products are made by spectrally scanning a huge range of soil samples, including the can't exactly recall 7,000 or 8,000 soil samples we've collected across the continent to help refine their models and then provide that information through. So in some ways it's quite collaborative as well. And as you can see there, it talks also about the ability to scale from the continental down to the regional, and in some cases sort of property scale. Some of the uses of that data, there's way too many uses of all of our different data types to do a comprehensive list of them within a short webinar. But just for each of the scales of monitoring, just give a few examples. So there's soil moisture monitoring that occurs, and the modelling that goes with that to enable soil moisture products to be provided to the community. There's pollen forecasting, which is one that's had a reasonable amount of uptake, so that you can understand when there's high amounts of pollen in the air, etc. And the same with dust storm forecasting, so the ability to detect when dust storms are likely and where they're going to have their impact. Moving on to surveillance, and the component TERN I know most well because it's sort of my everyday work, if you like. We look at those components, what's changing in the environment, what's the direction and magnitude of that change. And so the platform here based at in the Davies building with currently about 18 staff, and we're adding a heap to that with a couple of projects that tie into this next year. So the team will expand to almost 30 next year. And a component of them, the field team, go right across the continent, conducting a range of field surveys to sample all the vegetation and soils in those communities and make that data available. And so one of the advantages of that is it provides a nationally consistent data set. So historically, each of the survey programs has been run out of state government programs. And so you'll see with many of the products, and the vegetation mapping product is a good example, that you get these strange changes in vegetation community that suspiciously look like state boundaries based on different methods and different ways of doing business. So the consistency at that continental scale enables us to do a good job right across the continent, but also really importantly feed into international programs where that kind of information is critical as well. And so the platform enables scientists, but also land managers. So it's important to note that we deliver to both communities, able to better detect and quantify change in the environment. Just a reminder, so really extensively sampled, so right across the continent. And the location where those sites are put is there's a range of science around that. There's the team are working on 5 publications at the moment that detail exactly how we quantify that. So where the team goes is based on an analysis of where they've been and what components of the Australian environment is already well described by that, and then picks areas that are most dissimilar to those that we've already collected. You'll notice a big gap in the sort of sandy deserts of Western Australia. That is in part about difficulty of access, but it's also about that we do have samples that cover off on the environmental space. So the environmental space missed by not having samples out there is actually surprisingly minor. We do intend to get there at some stage, but there's higher priorities as far as the putting surveys in areas that they will explain the most difference. It's also worth noting that some of our plots are located in transects specifically to look at changes along climatic gradients. And so these are areas, both the Northern Territory Transect, the South Australian Transect, and the Western Australian Transect. These are areas where we're anticipating change to be most noticeable and most rapid. And so making sure we've got plots in the right orientation there to cover off on those issues is important. And the one in New South Wales is largely an altitudinal transect. So that's also informative on issues like climate change, but in an altitudinal sense rather than a spatial sense. So our team provide a range of tools and services. So we work on standardized methods and produced a field survey manual that some of you may be familiar with. But recently we've been engaged on a huge program with the federal government over the next 3 years or so to develop another 19 different methods and protocols that will be used for both the land care program and also to aid consultants when they're collecting information for environmental assessment that will be assessed against the EPBC Act. One of the interesting parts of that program is we collect a range of samples and specimens, and so it's not just about enabling you to have access to ecological data, it's also about enabling you to use samples and specimens for your work as well. So we take vegetation voucher samples, so every species we come across in every plot is vouchered and kept and ID'd through a herbarium. We have about 50,000 samples of those, the majority of which are based in the Davies building and available for use. We have around 50,000 genetic and isotope samples as well. So these are leaf tissue samples that you're able to apply for use and use for a range of applications, genetics and isotopes being two of the more common. There's soil, pit and subsurface samples, so about 37 soil samples are taken in each of our plots at about half a kilo, and they're all stored and made available as well. And then metagenomic samples too, so soil samples that are collected and stored in a way to enable them to be genetically analysed. And we have a set of researchers at the moment that are quite interested in the information you can extract from that. And some interesting publications already from that as well. So our data is the sort of traditional ecological data, but we can feed into things like species richness, diversity, abundance, cover, composition, structure, vegetation state, vegetation heterogeneity, structural complexity, soil carbon, nutrient stocks, a massive array of information, but interestingly it's multidisciplinary. So it's not particularly common that where you do really extensive vegetation samples, you'd also take really expensive soil samples and both for enabling genetic analysis as well. So its multidisciplinary nature enables kinds of analyses that perhaps people haven't contemplated in the past as well. We have a really large photo library and standard methods to collect those photos, where we take 3 complete panoramas from our plots. But that enables, in a research sense, and we're hoping in the near future that'll be in an operational sense, where you can actually calculate basal area from the plot using machine learning from our photos. All of our data is collected on an app in the field, which helps speed up the process of the whole downstream data management, but also enhances the standardization because it gives us control over what's actually collected in the field. It's none of this freehand entry or whatever. We make the app so that you have to enter the data in that standardized kind of way. We regularly run training programs, and indeed that's a component of our work that will increase over the next year or so. So some practical hands-on training programs. So we focus on sort of explaining the theory and then demonstrating and going through that in practice in the field as well, and provide advice on monitoring programs and projects as well. So our standard methods, some of you may have seen the right OzPlots protocol on the right. So that's a manual with 13 chapters that really clearly articulates how you can collect each of these bits of information in the field. And recently in the centre there recently had published the rationale behind that method. But along with that, there's specific methods for tall eucalypt forests. There's published drafts that we will work on in the next year or two for woodlands and condition and vertebrate fauna as well, and a range of methods in development around invertebrates and more rapid methods we're helping the government or work on for environmental assessment. And also, I alluded to the UAV methods that are in development as well. It's worth just a quick discussion of how we collect information. So this is quite a simplistic diagram, but it does help demonstrate the ease of which this process happens. So the data is collected and entered onto a tablet in the field. As soon as you're in mobile phone range, that can then be synced up to our cloud-based database storage. So our corporate database is on the cloud, and the tablets can automatically send information to that. When that happens, there's a range of curation tools, and we've created some web curation tools so that the team can interact and curate that data, add in herbarium identifications, etc., and anything they need to, and enable that data to be published. And as soon as we're happy that that data's finished, so to speak, it's then made available by a range of ways. The most common and notable at the moment is Ozplots R. So that's an R package you can download from CRAN, and it provides some guidance on how to download the data, but really importantly helps you calculate out many of the parameters they cover, and enables you to access the sample identification numbers, and it's most notable too in that it's updated nightly. So every night, any new information that's published into our database will be accessed via that method. Less frequently, there's these other couple of ways, but the core TERN program, the ECOS interface is being significantly re-engineered at the moment. So we anticipate that'll have much greater uptake in a year or two's time. For those who haven't been into the Davies building of late, you'll notice if you stick your head through a few of the windows on the doors there, a range of boxes and samples like this. So this is our archive, and over the coming weeks, hopefully before Christmas, you'll notice the shed across the road there from the Davies will be demolished, and we'll be building in the new year a great big shed, purpose-built shed to store all these samples. There are 4 kinds of samples I've alluded to there. On the left, you can see our genetic samples from every species at every plot. In the boxes at the top at the centre, there is all our voucher samples, our vegetation, proper voucher samples. The bottom of the centre, our soil metagenomic samples stored there for genetic work. And there's a huge shed out at Roseheathy that most of you won't be familiar with, but that stores many, many tonnes of soil. So the photo there only shows about a quarter of the shed. So there's about currently 1,500 and increasing rapidly of those milk crates full of soil that's available for use. Some of the outcomes that are really exciting from the program, we've found an extinct grass. So in Tasmania last year, that was interesting. Less exciting, but sort of interesting nonetheless, that we can hopefully get on top of it before it spreads. But Australia's newest weed, certainly knowing it's there enables people to work out what's going on there. So there's a picture of it. Program was done to looking at our soil metagenomic samples, that its aim was to look at secondary metabolites, so those genetic components that are most likely to lead to drug discovery. And the outcome of that project suggested that if you want to maximize your ability to take samples that have relevance to drug discovery, you would maximize your latitudinal sampling. And interestingly, we fed into this international program too, that enabled us to look at forests in dryland areas across the world. This is really notable because historically all the climate projections, etc., have just assumed that drylands consist of grass. This study showed that that's not the case, but most interestingly, our data enabled the accuracy assessment for this program. There wasn't other data available to them to do the accuracy assessment. And it led to an increase in forest estimates by 9%. And so that leads us on to the third component monitoring, third scale monitoring, and what we call ecosystem processes, and primarily looking at the why is change occurring and how do we mitigate unwanted change. And so the process platform monitors environments to a really high level of detail, but at a small number of representative sites. And I think the aspiration there, we haven't reached it yet, the aspiration would be to have a site in each of the major communities across Australia. So this is done through really intensive field stations where there's some really significant instrumentation. There's the flux tower where they measure a whole lot of gaseous fluxes between the vegetation, the soil, and the atmosphere. And a whole lot of those sites are often the focus for validation, calibration of the imagery, along with traditional surveys as well. So our normal ecological monitoring is done at those sites as well. And many of you know that Waite has been operating a site based out of UA here, but up in the Riverland at Cowpram for many years now. That is the only example of mallee ecosystems being monitored in this way internationally. So just a few sites there. So there's about 10 active sites at the moment, with a few more that just take the flux information, looking at trying to get a good grip of the different environments across the country. So ecosystem processes monitor in different ways. So they use these instruments that are able to measure change in the environment, and they do that on a really fine temporal depth. So it's not my area of expertise, but some of these measures are coming in multiple times a second, I'm led to believe. They also include remote camera traps and time-lapse imagery of vegetation and acoustic sensors and climate sensors, and as I alluded to before, those sensors that detect the gaseous exchange. And they help researchers build a complete picture of the biodiversity at that site, feeding into other programs as well, and have both biophysical and biological data streams. So the eddy covariance information that's that gaseous exchange. So it's directed out there measuring all the time, and it determines those fluxes between those ecosystem components and that above the canopy at the whole ecosystem scale, and help measure the productivity, etc., of those systems. And as you can see, they lead to products such as gross primary productivity there, etc., that we can plot through time, so we can understand how the seasonal effects and the rainfall effects and the temperature effects, etc., mean that those environments change through time, how they interact. And you can see there that some of those measures are only half hourly, that enable us to understand sinks and sources and greenhouse gases, and understanding the same environment under different climatic conditions can be a sink or a source. So it enables us to have a better understanding of that. And there's also the supersite. So the supersite terminology is used to describe all the other ecological measures collected at these same sites. And so some of those measures are collected 6 monthly, some annually, some once every 5 years. Of so many of those biological processes, so that much the same information the surveillance team collect there. There's high temporal resolution data on greenness and to get at that kind of change using phenocams, and some biological activity monitoring using acoustic monitoring techniques as well. You can see there a whole lot of time outputs where the x-axis there is time, so how things are changing at these one site but through time. And you can get the diagram on the bottom right there is a spectrogram of the acoustic monitoring, getting an idea of what's occurring when in the environment by measuring sounds out there. Some examples of use is that this infrastructure is used widely for drought research. So there's global experiment called DroughtNet that many of these sites are feeding into to understand how ecosystems right across the globe respond to drought. And some of the findings there help to predict and mitigate impacts of drought in Australia and around the world. They are used for global satellite validation, and so I think 8 or 10 of the sites are used quite extensively by the international community to validate a huge range of satellite sensors. And also there's the ability to detect those, the biological and biodiversity responses to climate change. And so some of their information there, particularly from the wet tropics, has been able to feed into those and help predict climate change impacts. And then it leads us into the last part of TERN, which is the data synthesis and delivery and analysis capability. So you remember from my initial diagram that sort of the showing off to the side that gathers that information and makes it available publicly. So TERN has these sort of main principles. When our data is all provided open access, you only have the obligation to acknowledge its use so that we can gather the statistics about how widely it's being used and enable the funding to continue. So there's a whole lot of data infrastructure we can build, and that makes so many components easier if you're able to access that, and it takes some of the data management and curation aspects into a more centralized way and easy to conduct. The survey methods, protocols and collections and the tools to do that are widely acceptable, as are those from the instruments as well. So there's different data types there. So the services and analytics team provides access to all of our data and some additional external ecological databases. So they do make available some of the state agency data sets as well. It uses the FAIR principles of findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable data. Its aim is to enable some data visualization prior to access so that you can interrogate the data and get a feel for it and understand whether it's going to meet your needs before you download it. It enables programmatic access. So those are familiar with the technology, we have APIs where if you have any kind of computerized programs running that you can interact with our data, you can hit that API and extract the data in a machine-to-machine sense. It improves the usability of our data, and a component of their program is support skill development. Makes ease of access and use, so a team dedicated to making the user experience easier and better. The data is all really well described, and so you have all the contextual information. So often it's not just simply the data, but the contextual information about how it was collected and why it was collected, and that information is just as important. We make sure that all of that's available to you, and it enables much more widespread public access and use of the data. I discussed FAIR already, but we have a data team comply to international standards where that's relevant, and make sure that all that data is fit for purpose. Support compatibility with so many other applications and our similar agencies internationally. They enable scaling of support as well, and interoperability, and also on their radar is becoming interoperable with the National Environmental Prediction System, which will be built shortly. So a couple of use examples that the data services and analytics team has specifically facilitated was students providing long-term monitoring records for the reef, and that's enabled some notable analyses to come from that in a time series sense, and also the Queensland government data set. You can see there the image on the bottom right animating, where it enables researchers right across the country to utilise and use that Queensland government data set. There's multiple ways of accessing TERN data, and it depends on what data set you're specifically talking about as to the best way to get it. With significant work happening in the past year or so, but over the coming years, to make this data more accessible and then more intuitive when you try and use it. Surveillance data there, the middle at the top, the AusPlots R package is the most up-to-date way that you can utilize that data, but there's those other ways you can access that as well. With data being in three main types, so there's the gridded sort of remote sensing data, there's the traditional plot-based data, and there's the sort of time series data where you've got a sensor regularly sending back information on the same variable. And just before finishing up, it's worth discussing how this sits in the future landscape. So the NCRIS program's looking at a national environmental prediction system, and we're working hard to make sure all of our data will be able to feed into that, along with so many of the other significant data sets and information sources right across the country, to have a more holistic sort of environmental prediction system into the future. And so that pretty much finishes up my talk. And it's worth identifying that this isn't just the team here in Adelaide. It's supported by NCRIS, it's hosted at the University of Queensland, but is truly collaborative across a huge range of organisations right across the country. And just down the bottom there's my email address and phone number if anyone's got any queries they're not keen to ask during the talk. Certainly happy to field queries offline as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. If anybody does have any questions that they'd like to ask now, can you type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I will read them out to Ben. So thank you, Ben. That was fascinating. Many of us wouldn't know that all this is stored on campus, so it's very enlightening. So any questions from people? You can type them into the Q&A box, please. Someone. No. Hang on. Okay. So a question from Reese Williams. Do you use Nectar Cloud or other cloud/HPC for data analysis?
I'm not sure about that specific example, but yeah, there is across TERN's network, there's significant usage of different HPC capabilities for the different analysis done by each of those three scales of data collection, and then the data services team use that as well. If you're interested in more info on that, I can put you in contact with a more relevant person to chat to about that rather than me.
Okay, I've got a question from Alina. What type of field sampling do you use at the bottom level of the data gathering? Is it random transect or geosampling?
Oh, okay. So I didn't have the time to get into that in detail, but our method's based on 1 hectare plot. So we go out and in a particular ecosystem, we pick a relatively homogeneous area, and then we lay out using DGPS, so its location can be really accurately re-identified, 100 by 100 metre quadrat. And within that quadrat, there's about 12 or 13 different parameters we collect. One of the core parts of our method is to do 5 horizontal, so to speak, and 5 vertical transects. If you're looking at a picture of of our plot, with 1,000-point intercepts based at the species level, so that we can get really accurate measures of cover to see how that changes through time, full species identification, all the samples, etc. We discussed earlier, basal area. The manual is publicly accessible, and yeah, there's about 11 different components to our data collection.
Okay. A question from Arlene Scott. In ecological surveillance, do you collect data on plant health, i.e. pests and diseases?
We don't. No, that's more likely done at the process, ecosystem processes level. But I wouldn't be sure. I'd have to find more information on that for you. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Time for one or two more if anybody has any. No. If not, I'd like to thank Ben very much for sharing all the information about what TERN does. If you would like to access any of the data or any of the samples, please get in contact with Ben. Next week, on the 3rd of December, we have 2 early career researchers from the School of Ag, Food and Wine speaking. So Dr. An Pham speaking on the utilisation of novel genetic diversity to increase barley yield nationally, and Dr. Shuwan Yang speaking about pectin methyl esterases, how they control the longitudinal growth of the ovule and grain in barley. So hopefully you can join us again next week. So once again, thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for attending.
Cheers.